Okay, good afternoon everyone and welcome to Commetric's webinar, Identifying Influencers and Stakeholders. And we're going to be looking at our insight-driven approach today. Thanks for joining us. This is part of the AMEC Measurement Month. A bit about myself. My name is Sarah Curnow. I'm Director of Insight at Commetric. I've worked in this industry for nearly 20 years and my role is to make sure our clients get the maximum benefit from some of our award-winning products. So today we're going to be going over, first I'm going to introduce you to the company a little bit, then have a look at influencer marketing today and the situation and why we think this is something that is worth looking at. I'm then going to take you through our approach to influencer analysis and stakeholder analysis, and I'll follow on with some case studies, some real life examples where we've used our approach to great effect and what our sort of approach can show you. And finally we'll end with any questions. On that point, if you do have any questions that you think of as we're going along, please just type them into the panel on the right hand side of the screen in the webinar panel, and we'll pick them up at the end and make sure we get back to you. Okay, so who are we? We're a media analytics company. We have been working in this field for more than 20 years. As well as news and social media analysis, we have a strong offering in influencer mapping and network analysis. Overall, we call ourselves data agnostic, and what that means is that we take the content that is the best fit for our company. We're not tied to any one particular content provider. We want to make sure there are no gaps in the solution that we can offer. And we work with lots of the leading data aggregators and some of the leading tools as well. We use a natural language processing in our platforms, and our platforms are proprietary, so the platforms we use to parse the data and categorize it and so on. This means that human speech as it is spoken is understood by the platform. And we like to work with various different output formats, as I'll show you a bit later, but we find that this is driven by our clients and a particular output that works for them, be it report, workshop and so on. Now, onto our clients. We're very proud of our client roster and the big names that we work with. We work directly with brands and organisations, and we also do a lot of work with agencies. We work all over the world. About 80% of our work is multi-market, and different languages, multi-language projects are a particular strength of ours. We have 30 different languages in-house and a wide network of freelancers that plug any language gaps that we don't have on our own team. Okay, so on to influencer marketing. And why did we feel that this was something that was worth talking about today? Well, basically, it's something that we are asked about more and more. More and more of our clients are very interested in it. So we developed software that would analyse influencers pretty much at the beginning of the company, as I say, more than 10 years ago, but we're definitely seeing an uptick in desire to use it over the last 3 to 4 years. This also is borne out by industry statistics. So like all good researchers, I hunted out some data to support our anecdote, and as we can see, it's the fastest growing online customer acquisition method. So 22% of methods relates to influencer marketing, and in a survey of companies to ask how much they expected their influencer marketing budget to change, 48% of those companies said they expected it to increase going forward. 23% thought it would stay the same. So we know that there is a definite need for influencer marketing, a demand for it, and we think that's probably come with developments in ad blocking. So it's in online marketing, it's much harder to support pop-up ads and that type of thing. But also we need to not forget business-to-business marketing, and that's something I want to talk about quite a lot today. So influencer marketing in consumer marketing has always been popular. It relates to the usual benefits of PR, the power of the referral. We have people like, the rise in bloggers, who are seen as people like you and I, who can be seen as a friend and an attainable friend, if you like. They are now endorsing products, families like the Kardashians, for example. But it's also very significant in business-to-business marketing. So there we have the rise of the CEO, or the significance of the CEO, and the importance of what they're communicating about your company. So we see this more and more, where senior executives and CEOs are seen as a reflection of a company's expertise. They are relied upon to spread the company's thought leadership initiatives, and they can also, individuals can also be used in partnership. So a very obvious one is Sheryl Sandberg and her work around women in the workforce, and with McKinsey in particular, and her own Lean In initiative, and initiatives like that, where companies pair up with experts or academics to portray their own culture and expertise. So a lot of our work is around understanding how those sorts of campaigns are doing, but also whether there are any live wires in the company who are communicating on their own. And that goes back to this rise in social media and self-publishing, whether it's via a blog or LinkedIn or on Twitter, and being able to keep a track of what senior executives or any executives within a company are saying that might reflect upon the company, and also harnessing that for the good, you know, so you can measure what is being communicated to your potential audience. Now, that's a lot of talk about influencers, but I also want to talk about stakeholders today. So stakeholders, while they might not have a direct influence on, say, your company's sales, they may well have an impact on your company or your organization's license to operate. And by that we mean stakeholders that might be involved in regulation, or stakeholders who might influence consumer opinion, or regulatory opinion, government opinion, and so on. So issues such as arsenic in food, and whether that's a growing issue or whether it's contained within a certain area, we'd take a look at that sort of thing. Or something like electronic cigarettes, and whether they are a great substitute for tobacco or not such a great substitute, and how regulation and consumer opinion affects the development of all of those market trends. We'd also look at things like what the hot topics are being spoken about at somewhere like the World Economic Forum. So we tend to do a piece of work every year around Davos, and who the speakers are, what they're going to be talking about, who they're talking with, and so on. And that really helps our clients to engage with those people, communicate about similar issues, make sure they understand what the hot topics are, and so on. And then finally we have regulation. So I'm going to show you some examples later of a piece about seismic drilling, and this was something that's quite common in the oil and gas industry for exploration, and the way regulation can impact that. So this is also about understanding your stakeholders. Okay, so first of all, I just want to touch on some of the methodology that we use here at Commetric, and how we manage to reach the final pieces of analysis that we would provide. So without spending too long on this, I don't want to bore you with the nitty-gritty, but I think it's useful just to understand what we do. So we would start off by gathering together a sample of content, and we would take that from the places that are most relevant. So it might be news media, it might be social media, it might indeed be a client's own data. Then we go through a process of integrating that data. So there might be some cleaning involved, there might be changes we need to make sure that the different data sets are comparable. Next, we use an auto-filtering process, and this is where we use our technology to take out a lot of the legwork in finding relevant content and coding it into the way that we need to be able to see it. After that, we use our team of analysts to again clean that data and make sure it's coded in the right way. And then we take it a step further. So now we have a nice content set which matches our clients' interests, which talks about the area that they're interested in, and it's pulled out all of the organisations, all of the individuals, the journalists, the publications, and so on. But there's another layer that we want to add to that, and that is a much more I don't want to say subjective, but it's a much more, it's an area where we feel the human is more powerful. This is where we don't think the technology can necessarily take over, not at this stage anyway. And that relates to sentiment analysis, and we want to be very careful that we allow for things like sarcasm and irony and those other nuances, and also that the analysis relates to the client's own objectives, so what they consider to be negative and positive in relation to their own strategy. And also we look at the subtopics, so we will analyse for the hot topics of the moment and chart accordingly. When we have all of this data is pulled through our media research platform, and there are quality checks at every point along the way, and then finally it's output into summaries and reports or workshop. We have a range of reports that we like to use, and again it depends on the client's needs. It might be that somebody needs a daily alert, it might be that this is more of a strategy setting exercise, and usually with influencer analysis it has a longer range, it doesn't change day by day. And so we might offer it in a workshop, for example, and those workshops can be really powerful and very useful because they spark ideas. So as we're feeding back some of the findings, so our clients are led off in different directions because it's contradicting what they thought or maybe confirming what they thought. So they can be really, really fun way to go through the insights and how it's going to affect the client's communication strategy and so on. Another technique that we're using more and more frequently is, of course, the infographic, which I am sure you are all more than aware of. We just find it's a very useful way to bring the insights off the page in a very quick way, particularly if you have a large audience and you want to simplify the findings in a way that's still relevant but is grabs the attention. So that's something we do more and more of. Okay, so that's the method. Now I'm just going to go on to show you some case studies. And I'm going to include, we won an award for our work from AMEC. This was last year, a gold award for most impactful client recommendations arising from a measurement study. And this was for IDF, the International Diabetes Federation, and of course I had to include it today. It most remiss of me not to. So I'm going to start with some pictures from that work, but I will also be including some other examples that really illustrate how this network analysis can work. Okay, so the IDF study took a look at the sugar debate. It followed the World Health Organization ruling, or guidance rather, about recommended levels of sugar in a person's diet. And for the IDF, it was very important for them to develop their relationships and their partnerships with different organizations, third parties globally. So they needed to find out who those experts were, who those third parties were, who the opinion leaders were in different countries, so that they might join with them and communicate in a cohesive manner. It was also important for the IDF to ensure that their own messaging was coherent and was complementary to the WHO's communications and to the other experts' communications. So this is the first sort of map that we would show as part of an influencer analysis. And what this is showing us is who the individuals are in relation to the different subtopics. So we've looked at the subtopics in the debate, and you can draw together, sort of summarize what they are. And you can immediately see that healthy and balanced nutrition is one of the main subtopics in this field. It's the place that most of the influencers are talking about. And of course, sometimes you don't necessarily need to know where most people are. You might want to find out where few people are, but I'll come on to that later. The colour coding of the circles tells us what sort of influencer is speaking. In this case, we see a map that is heavily dominated by a green bubble, and that denotes that it's an expert or an academic. The size of the bubble or the circle indicates how much of a voice they have, so how much they're either speaking. They don't have to be directly quoted. It may be that they are continually being referred to, and so this isn't necessarily a measure of coverage, but it's a measure of who is being mentioned in association with this debate. And that's quite an important point, because if I show you the next, another chart, so if you look here, this is all green because it's all about experts and academics. But if we look at, say, seismic testing, for example, which is where you are looking at, seismic testing is a way of exploring for oil, and it's heavily regulated. And so the main people in this chart, at first glance, are politicians, closely followed by interest groups. So there's an interplay here between interest groups and politicians. So the colour coding gives you a good idea of who is speaking, but also this goes back to my point about this isn't necessarily those people that are speaking. Quite often government regulators, for example, won't actually quote, or won't actually give a comment or a quote. They will do that very sparsely over a year, just when they have a big announcement, but they're often being talked about in association with a particular issue. Okay, so the other way, obviously, some of these charts you can very quickly see what is the main category, but sometimes you need a bit more, some numerical data to actually display that point. So we also will break it down into a pie chart format, and that will show you, give you the data that supports those. There we go, sorry about that delay. So here we go, this tells you quantitatively, we can see 23% of influencers were in the interest group category. If we look at the organisation types, 28% were a government agency. The difference here is the influencer is the individual, and obviously the organisation is the company or organisation or whatever, and they're not always equal. That also differs according to the topic that you're looking at. So some topics have a lot of individuals commenting, some have very, very few. Okay, so once we know who the influencers are, we can then start drilling down into those influencer groups, and we can isolate the ones that we want to pay a particular focus on. So this these maps are interactive. You can have this delivered in a dashboard format, and by clicking on any of these green circles will take you through to the content where that person is mentioned or quoted. And similarly, the subtopics, you can click through and find out what that subtopic is all about. Of course, if you have this delivered in a report format, we do all of that hard work for you and pull out the key points per topic, per influencer, the things that we're seeing that look interesting and are worth paying attention to. So when you've had a look and you've explored who the influencers are, and you've explored what different groups are saying about different things and what the topics are, you're probably going to want to know what exactly your people are doing or saying, or your influencer are doing or saying in this space. So here we can look at a different cut of the data, which it just displays it in a slightly different way. So here we can see this was actually a piece of work about women in the workforce, and I'm going to refer to this a few times. So we've seen the different categories at play within this topic. So there's things like gender parity, influential women, the share of women in the workforce, women in senior corporate positions, and so on. And this chart shows us, similar to the previous chart, it just shows us which are the companies that are related to which are the subtopics. And what you can do from here is click on any one of those individuals So this, for example, is Facebook, and it relates to women in senior corporate positions, influential women, gender parity, and so on. This is the World Economic Forum, and it relates to gender parity and gender income gap and women in government. And the thickness of the line will tell you where, or the subtopic that that person is speaking about more. So there was a big World Economic Forum conversation about gender parity in the year that this study took place. There's been a lot of coverage of that, and obviously that's driving that coverage. Sorry, that link there. Then you can drill down into your peers and your competitors, so we can isolate just the companies that you might compare to, and that brings me on to a wider point actually about competitors and peers. We always recommend, as well as looking at your competitors, to include a peer group, because we find so often that there are particular companies that appear in many different spheres, excuse me, purely because they are seen to be at the forefront of many initiatives. So it's often technology related, but not always, or they're seen as young and cutting edge or dynamic companies. So any view of entrepreneurship is going to include Google and Amazon, and similarly Facebook is mentioned in relation to women in the workforce because of Sheryl Sandberg and her communications about women at work and so on. So it's always worth having a look at peers as well, and this influencer process can help you to understand who your peers are, and that really helps companies come out of their possibly siloed view of the world. So often a company will be very entrenched in maybe its internal mechanizations and its immediate clients, when actually for some of these big issues they need to be looking at a much broader space, because the real leaders are not in their immediate world, and that can be quite illuminating. And also, of course, you can learn lessons from some of these peer groups. Okay, now if you want to, as I said before, we can present, this is a very visual way to present data that clients really like, because it very obviously shows that in this case McKinsey were and Facebook were very dominant in this area. But you might need the data to support that. So we also produce tables which provide, sorry, I've just gone forward too many, there we go, which provide our influencer index, so the weighting, if you like, and that is calculated using an algorithm similar to the algorithm used by Google to push the top results to the top. So it's looking at volume of coverage, it's looking at how many links there are between topics and individuals. So if an individual is linked to more topics, if one individual is linked to more topics than another, they will have a higher index. If one individual is linked to a topic that has lots of other individuals linked to it, they'll be pushed higher in the index, and so on. So it's just a quantitative way to show the relative influence of each of the individuals. Okay, now on to what are the current trending topics. So this is another very common use for this type of study. And again, I'm going to use the women in the workforce topic because it's quite, it's an interesting one, and it's very current, and it shows us some nice examples. So in this case, we can see that what we've done here is in this chart, in the table on the left, we've simply compared the previous period with the current period. So we can see women in senior corporate positions, it was 27% of the total conversation, but it had fallen by the following year to 22%. Gender parity, on the other hand, had risen quite significantly. We also map this on an interactive dashboard, so you can have we trend this on our interactive dashboard, so you can interact with this to click down into any of those peaks and find out what exactly was driving that peak in coverage at that point. It just helps you explore some of the content that is being published at the time. It might highlight some of the events, or indeed you would hope that if you have a campaign, it will show you how your campaign is performing. So you can do pre-campaign analysis and then follow it up to see the impact that your campaign has had on that particular topic. Just to show you also how we would do this according to your competitive group. So this is just taking a view of some of the management consultancies, and here we would look at, so let's just take gender parity again, how the key companies in that sector are communicating about gender parity. Now that's useful to show who dominates it, and also to see where what your competition is doing in comparison to what you are doing. Taking me on to a related point, which is about the white space. So this is where we're looking to find a gap in the discourse. So which topics are flooded and your voice is unlikely to be heard, or are already dominated by a competitor that you really don't want to go against because it's a little bit too close and you want to be differentiated in the marketplace. So we also use this type of data to find that sort of white space. Okay, so just looking, sorry, I've skipped on to that. Let's go back. This is the same table that I showed you a moment ago, but we've also added in columns which show the percentage of the total mentions and how this share has increased. So here we can see gender parity has grown, so it increased from 14% to 19%, and that equated to 23% of the overall conversation in the most recent time period. And that was a percentage point change. It was up 4 percentage points. So that's actually, although it's a growing topic and it's one you may decide you want to have a voice in, you might want to have something in the game, as it were, it might not be one that you want to try and own or put a great deal of effort into your initiatives with, because it's already pretty well covered by lots of other people. If we look at something like share of women in the workforce, for example, now that hasn't grown as much, but it's still taking up a smaller proportion of the overall. So that might be quite interesting. Or women in the government. Now this is an interesting one because it has grown, and it doesn't have such a large share. So this could be an area that you could start to explore in more detail because it's not such a dominated place. We can see it is definitely growing, so you'd have to be quick because the change in share has also grown quite significantly by 5 percentage points. So that means it was a 6% share last period, excuse me, and it's 11% share this period. So maybe let's have a look at what that looks like. This is where we drilled. Let's have a look at women in government and drill down into it. And what this shows us is that lots of the conversation is actually at quite a high level with politicians and government officials. And this period was in the lead up to the US election. So there's a great deal of conversation, as we can well remember, between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton about women in government. Whereas the corporate voice in this time period was actually very low. So it could be a place that you could start to communicate. It might be something you want to keep an eye on, or have a drill down into some of the content that's driving that conversation, so you can understand what's driving it and whether it's something to get involved with. Okay, so when you've had a look at this and you understand where you are, what the hot topics are, what the growing topics are, what sort of people are already in this conversation, and where there is white space, or which are the topics that you would like to communicate upon, then it's a good idea to find out where the conversation is actually taking place. So I always consider this, it's a bit more of a practical use of the network analysis, or even an evaluation type of use. So this can be used for finding out, well, basically, what does it tell you? It tells you the channels being used to communicate about these topics. So where are these organisations being mentioned? We can also show how the channel is talking about certain topics rather than others, or whether they may be focusing on certain influencers or certain groups of influencers. So it's a very practical information, and again, this can be, we can export this into a table, as we've seen before, even to Excel spreadsheets, and we often embellish that information with contact details and so on, so that you have your very own specific media list developed just for this purpose. Similarly, we can also show the journalists that are writing about your particular issue and your particular influencer. So this is great for targeting, and it's also good for evaluation. So we might use this to show the relative performance of different publications, or the strong relationships with journalists, whether you're getting more coverage in a particular type of media. It could be a trade, it could be news, it could be consumer or lifestyle, or it might be, you know, a blogger or a forum or Twitter or so on. So that's something that we can show by looking at the channels involved. And while we're talking about evaluation, we also use this for seeing how stakeholders and influencers have entered a conversation and the impact they have had. So this is, I mean, this is what people always want to understand, isn't it? Have your efforts really moved the needle? Have you been able, by undertaking these efforts, have you been able to influence anything at all? And for example, in this case, when we first looked at this particular women in the workforce area, we looked at this company's representatives were mentioned only in association with these two categories. However, when we came back the following year, we found that that number had grown to 19 different spokespeople in association with different subtopics. So as a result of their activities, the number of spokespeople in this conversation had dramatically increased. And some of that was related to, it was people in the organisation that already had this profile, or sorry, already had quite a big profile, and it was a case of tweaking what they were saying and where to marry it all together with other initiatives within the company. So it always seems like such common sense, but this is the data that supports it and shows it and proves it back to the business, so that you can present your case going forward. It's important you speak about this then, because it really does have an impact. And we can go into a great deal of detail on what those people are saying. So we can show you how individuals' profile has changed. So some organisations talk about their, you know, a ranking of senior executives. That can also be used on Twitter, who's got a bigger profile on Twitter, who's undertaking the most activity, and then we can drill right down into messaging. So who is on message, essentially, or as I mentioned earlier about the wild cards in your company, who is maybe out there communicating you didn't actually know was communicating, and they might be very useful, and it might be someone that just has a natural desire to publish on Twitter or to speak at events, and you weren't quite aware of it, and so you can bring them into the fold and make sure that they're talking in the way you want them to, essentially, or incorporating some of your initiatives. Okay, so that pretty much, that's a rattle through the way that we approach influencer network analysis. I hope that gave you a good introduction to the topic. I must apologise again about the problems with the sound at the beginning of the broadcast. If you would like me to follow up, we'll hopefully get that ironed out with the recordings, if you wanted to listen to it again there, or if you just want to run through any of these aspects, just get in touch and we can have a quick conversation on the phone or a coffee or whatever. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to questions. let me just check the panel and see what we have. If you've got any questions, please send them through now, and we can have a look at those. Let me just... Okay. So, can this method be used for other data sets other than news media? Okay, so I mentioned social media, but we can also, yes, we can, basically. We can use it for things like analyst reports. We could use it for reputation rankings. We can use it for... What we have done is used it with a client's own data. And this sort of relates to another question. My client has very firm ideas about who they think is influential. Can you allow for this? So this is a connected point. We have done some workshops where all of the data going into these maps, it comes from the client's own experiences and understanding of who is influential for them. And that then becomes very powerful, particularly when you combine it with influence in the news. So particularly around things like regulation. This particular case was about transport regulation. So there are many people that had an impact on the development of transport regulation, and we then mapped it. So the client could show that internally to explain their strategy for outreach, basically. Okay, so we've got here. Are you providing software or a service? Interesting. Okay, so we're service providers that have our own proprietary software. So we do enable, it is possible to use some of our media analytics software, but it's almost a separate offer. So we have some clients, maybe some in agencies, for example, that do some of their own analysis in-house. And our system, I would like to say, is excellent at doing this and enabling it. So, but it is for the expert user. It's certainly a step on from Excel or Access databases, and as such it needs some training, which we provide. So we do that, but on the whole, the majority of our work is actually a service. So whether that's influencer network analysis, tends to be quite consultative, because it's often quite strategic, and it's very individual, very bespoke, be a better word. So yeah, so we tend to focus on more of a service. How does it take for you to typically produce a report? Good question, and a very common one from clients. So obviously it depends on the report, and the variables will be how large the content set is, and that also impacts the budget to some extent. But we can advise on that. We're experts at making sure your sample is the most relevant and concise for your budget and your time frame. So we've turned around these reports in less than a week. The team are probably like, they've done it in quite a lot less than a week, actually, usually for a pitch purposes. However, we could, if there are multi-markets, multi-languages, multi-factors, such as different sector cuts and so on, it can take 2 to 3 months. But there will always be deliverables along the way. Okay. What do we have? Okay, yeah, another good question and very topical. What's the influence of social bots, fake news, if you will, within your processes? How do you determine what's real and what's not in the data? So that is really experience and technology. It's a combination of both. So we have processes built into our systems that remove obvious fake news and spam and so on. We then have processes in the software which will remove things like duplicates. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes we want to measure duplicates. Sometimes a company wants to see how many times their press release has been repeated. That's fine. We can turn it on or turn it off. And then it goes to the layer of editorial filtering. So once it's gone through those stages, it then gets to an editor who will check that the sample is robust and the data is clean and the content is relevant. Let's see. Is it possible to see who's being mentioned in the same coverage as my influencer? Yes, it is. So you can connect, you can show who is being, we have what's called a co-citation chart, which I didn't include in this report just for time purposes really, but it shows you the company you keep, as a colleague used to call it, so who is being mentioned alongside you. And that can also be interesting if you are doing sentiment analysis, so you're trying to find out who is positive about your topic, who's negative, and so on, and you can colour code your map according to whether they are whether the spokesperson is positive, negative or neutral. So then you have a nice map of yellow, green and red, and you can see very quickly who the fors and againsts are, which is very useful, as you can imagine, for lots of issues. Okay, I've got another one here, two more. Can you surface messages that lie outside of the hypothesis or brief? How would you present that? Yes, definitely, because the way Econometric works, and always has done, and this isn't just with influencer network analysis, this is with our media analysis work as well, which is very, obviously there's a lot of crossover. I don't want to get too much into process, but we would always look at the messaging that the client wants to convey or to measure, and then what we call discovered messages. So, and we will present that in two different slides or two different charts. So, okay, these are the messages you're tracking, this is how your spokespeople have performed against it, or how the organisation has performed, and then these are the messages that are coming across about you outside of that. We'd hope there wouldn't be too many shocks, but sometimes there are, and sometimes that, it's not necessarily negative. It might be that certain things can be tweaked and you can make the most of those. So yes is the short answer there. Okay, final. Oh no, there's quite a few more. Will you be giving us access to the slides afterwards? Yes, definitely. We were anyway, even without the audio issues. Can you please cover more about sentiment analysis? Okay, so as I just touched on sentiment analysis and how it would be used with influencer network analysis, and I mentioned at the beginning, I think post the restart, that it's one of the reasons why we put such a focus on having people and analysts. It's because we have found, or we feel, that the technology is not, it's nearly there but not quite there to understand things like sarcasm and irony and so on. So yeah, we will ensure that our analysts are doing sentiment analysis, and they are very connected to what the client is looking for. So that's particularly relevant when you're looking at a crisis situation where, probably the majority of your coverage is going to be negative, but the important thing is that your messaging is getting through, and therefore that can be classified as neutral or positive. And also, I mean, healthcare is a good example to use, I always think, about automated sentiment, because it's very difficult to code automated sentiment technology when you're looking at healthcare issues which naturally consider quite negative topics. So it's an area that we have a great deal of experience in, and our clients particularly really like that very detailed approach to sentiment analysis. And that approach also applies to topic analysis, to be honest, and messaging. It's that consideration of where does that communication fall and how is it perceived. Okay. Oh, I've just had a follow-up. So the piece about the messages that lie outside of the hypothesis or brief, how do you present that? And then co-citation for topics and messages. So we could do breakdown of messages per topic. That sort of naturally follows on that your message analysis falls into a particular topic, an overarching topic, if you will, and you can cut that according to spokespeople as well, and competitors, and so on. Okay, thank you. That's okay. Thank you for covering sentiment analysis. You mentioned crisis management requires almost constant feedback. Do you provide this? Yes, we do. We have a year-round 24/7 service. We have actually been called into crises on Christmas Day in the past. So yes, I mean, that's just part of the course. And not always just crises either. Things like M&A activity, IPO activity. The closer it gets to deadline, the more the monitoring and the analysis is ramped up. So yes, that is, as I mentioned before, it doesn't always relate to the network mapping. That those don't change on the fly always. I mean, they might do, but it tends to be more straightforward analysis of what's happening, really. But yes. Okay, that was a great bunch of questions. Thank you, everyone. I think we'll probably wrap it up there. Everyone that attended today will be sent the recording and the deck. And if you have any questions, as mentioned, please don't hesitate to reach out and connect on LinkedIn, or my email address is on the presentation. I'll be very happy to have a chat. Okay, so have a great day, and thanks again. Bye.